Tonight we welcome Dr. Sarah Elkind of San Diego State University. Sarah is an associate professor in environmental studies and history, yes?
In history mostly.
In history mostly. And if I get this correctly, your background is in sort of history of water in the West, and you're going to kind of talk to us a little bit more about water in California. So thank you. Let's welcome Sarah to our...
So I have notes, because if I don't use notes, then I just kind of go. And I don't want to just kind of go. So what I want to try to do, so I was listening to the news this morning, and the big news today about water is that the water levels in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta are so low that in order to save the fall Chinook salmon run, they have to truck the juveniles out to the ocean because there is not enough water, because our snowpack is so low and our rainfall has been so low. And so that seemed like an interesting way to start. And the fact that there is a drought alone does not explain why the fall Chinook are in such trouble. What does is the combination of the drought and all of the infrastructure that has been put into place to make sure that water is where people can use it and where people wanted to use it. Because over the last 150 years, California has basically been trying to build itself out of conflicts over water rights and problems with water shortages. And when you combine dams and canals and water diversions with a year of low flow, on the one hand, those dams and canals and diversions reduce the impact on water users, on human water users of that low rainfall. But it means that things like the Chinook salmon are in really deep trouble because what water is flowing is not flowing where they need it to be. One thing to keep in mind as I talk about this is that the fundamental precept behind the water development, the mindset that drove the water development that I'm going to talk about tonight, was that water that reached the ocean was wasted. And so the principle behind the water projects that I'm going to talk about was that every single drop of water that fell in the mountains should be captured by a reservoir, put into a canal, and used on the land. And the river should, in fact, by design, be dry by the time they got to the ocean, which is not great for fish. And that's why the Colorado River Delta is in such trouble, is that we have, in fact, fully appropriated all of the water out of the Colorado River. So what I want to do tonight is kind of give you a speed version of the big water developments in California. I'm going to look at my notes now so I don't get too far off. Let's see, other news to frame this is the news earlier this year that the Central Valley Project run by the Bureau of Reclamation will not be delivering any water to agricultural water users along its system. The state water plan recently announced that it also will be not delivering any water to irrigators. The Central Valley Project will be cutting its municipal water deliveries to 50%. So there are regions that will be hurt much worse than we will by those things, because 60% of San Diego's water comes from the Colorado River. But what's my number here? 20 to 30% comes from the state water plant. So San Diego will lose 20 to 30% of its normal water allocation. Another 20% of San Diego's water comes from local sources, and those are affected by our low rainfall, and you've seen how little there is. So if I were in charge, we would be rationing water today by mandatory, none of this voluntary water cutback thing. I would be like, no, now. Stop it. But nobody asked me. So, the focus tonight is going to be on, is kind of in that context. This is, and the kind of question that I got thinking about when Brock asked me to come and talk was, how did we get into this? Why is this drought going to affect San Diego in the particular way that it will? And I will note that San Diego has been getting the majority of its water from outside San Diego County since 1947, 80% of our water comes from outside San Diego County. And if it weren't for these systems, we would be in much worse shape this year than we are now. So there's a kind of, it's an ambivalent, conflicted thing, where on the one hand, there's some really big problems with these systems, and on the other hand, kind of environmentally, and on the other hand, we wouldn't all be living here if they didn't exist, because we wouldn't be able to, because there wouldn't be enough water. All right, so the public history of water development in California is, I have to remember to click back there, even though the slides are there, very complicated. This is actually a picture of New York City in the late 1890s, not 1990s. And I put this slide up because it represents the movement that led to widespread public ownership of municipal, as in urban, water systems starting in the late 19th century. And those water systems spread from big cities on the east that had very serious problems with epidemic disease and basic fundamental sanitation to the west. In the west, we didn't have problems with those epidemic diseases as much. I don't know why, because New York and Boston and Philadelphia had big public water systems, cities like New York, or cities like Los Angeles and Chicago and San Francisco and Seattle decided they had to too, to be class, sort of first-class cities. Water development in these eastern cities that had terrible problems with cholera and tuberculosis became a public utility much earlier than it did in the west, in part because there's more water in the east. So there was very little money to be earned by supplying people with drinking water. In the west, the water supplies, even where they're relatively plentiful, tend to fall in a few places. There are a few reservoirs, and it was very easy, very early on, for private companies to purchase those reservoir sites or acquire the water rights to those areas through prior appropriation and sort of lock in their control of the local water supplies, which meant when cities like San Francisco, this is my favorite slide of all time. This is actually street cleaning in New York City. Same street, before and after the creation of public street cleaning responsibilities as part of that sanitary stuff. It doesn't really belong in the lecture, but I really love it. Because it's really great, because it's so disgusting. It's mostly horse manure up there. Horse manure. Yeah. Okay. Resisting temptation. All right. So, in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles and Oakland, which is one of the cities that I've studied, private water companies were able to buy up and monopolize all the local sources of supply really, really early, which meant that by the time communities said, hey, these private water companies are doing a bad job, we want a public system either on principle or because we need better services, there was no water for them to develop. So they had to build very expensive systems that went out, where they had to go much further away for their water supply. So the East Bay went out to the Mokelumne River out by Lodi and had to negotiate in court with the Lodi irrigation districts to get access to the water supplies out there. San Francisco went out to Hatch Hatchie and took water from a national park, and Los Angeles went up to the Owens River Valley and diverted the Owens River Valley. This led to some really serious conflicts. This is one of the major incentives for the development of both of those water systems, San Francisco and Oakland, was the San Francisco earthquake and fire. When cities went outside into rural areas to take water because they had no access to the local supplies, because the local supplies were owned by the private water companies, they ended up in conflicts with irrigators. where the irrigation districts had established water rights to these rivers, and they objected to the cities taking what they saw as their water. And the solution was generally a technological solution. It was, if you build a dam, you can capture the flood flows, which nobody has claimed yet, and use those. That's what happened on the McCollum. That's also what happened at Hetch Hetchy. The Turlock Irrigation District claimed the water rights there to the regular flow of the Tuolumne River. But it left a very, it made for bad feelings between urban and rural areas, and those relations were tense anyway. And they were the most tense with the Owens River Valley, in part because Los Angeles did not build a reservoir there, but just diverted the flow of the LA River, of the Owens Valley, of the Owens River itself. And the people in the Owens Valley blew up the aqueduct because they were angry about the diversion of what they saw as their water by the city of Los Angeles. This event colored everything that happened after it, because it became a symbol of both the dangers of the power of cities in California politics. It became the symbol of everything that was wrong about Los Angeles, that they would go strong-arm people and take their resources. It was the kind of implicit, unstated threat about what would happen if cities in California kept going out to the countryside to take water away. This is why Los Angeles, when it needed more water and electricity starting in the 1920s, did not go up to the Sierra to get that water. They didn't go to Northern California to get that water. It was politically simpler for them to take the water from the Colorado River, because that didn't get LA kind of beat up in this conflict within California over water resources. So this is Hoover Dam. These are postcards of Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam is, it was proposed in 1922. It's a beautiful dam, which even I can admit, even though I think rivers should not be all dam. The story of Hoover Dam begins with an irrigation district that was established in the Imperial Valley in the very early days of the 20th century. A private irrigation company, irrigation developer, went out, took what was called at the time the Sonora Desert, built an irrigation canal that because of the topography there had to crisscross the Mexican border, renamed it the Imperial Valley, and promoted it like all good land speculators do. Everybody in California was a land speculator. And everything was kind of fine until 1905. And in 1905, there was a major flood, came down the Colorado River and overflowed the irrigation networks and kind of busted the irrigation system open. And it took 2 years to close the gap to stop the flooding. This is why we have the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea is all because of this flood. Even after the flooding stopped and they were able to kind of get the river contained again, they couldn't rebuild the irrigation system because the headwaters to the canal, the connection between the canal and the river, was in Mexico. And the Mexican government Mexico was at that time undergoing a period of, how shall we say, political unrest, and didn't want Americans crossing the border. And given the history of the Mexican-American War, I can't say as I blame them. But this meant that the irrigation district couldn't fix its canal system. And eventually, after years of trying to sort this out, they decided that the solution was a canal that didn't cross in and out of Mexico. But this was a canal that was going to be bigger and longer and more expensive, and not something that they could pay for by themselves. So they went to the next logical place, which was the federal government, which had just passed the Reclamation Act. And they're like, great, you guys can pay for our canal. And this was the plan that they eventually came up with. They couldn't, the congressional representative of the Imperial Valley was persuaded that the way to get this thing put together was not just to push for an all-American canal, which is, let me see, right along the border, but not crossing the border. No, it's over here, sorry. I don't know my geography very well. But rather to connect this idea of an irrigation canal that was to be built by the Reclamation, the Bureau of Reclamation for the Imperial Valley to a much larger project, a comprehensive project of flood control and hydroelectric power generation on the Colorado River. This is 1922. It didn't get approved for 7 more years, 4 filibusters at a time when nobody filibustered anything. This was so contentious. And it was so contentious in part because it was clear from the very beginning that most of the water and most of the hydroelectric power that was generated at that dam, at Hoover Dam, Cape Hoover Dam, was going to be headed towards Los Angeles. Okay, Los Angeles, which brought us this. Okay. So far so good. Sounds great, right? We'll have the federal government come in, they'll build this big dam, it'll be fantastic, it'll solve our problems. If you look cross-eyed at this, you can see it three-dimensionally. It's a trick you learn if you're subjected to lots of stereoscopic slides where you're a geology major. Okay. The problem with sending all of this water and power to Los Angeles is partly shaped by the public impression of Los Angeles because of the Owens Valley thing. It is also shaped by the fact that there's 7 states in the Colorado River Basin. This is the only large river in the Colorado River Basin, and all of those states knew that the water in the Colorado River was their future. Our Arizona in residence is nodding vigorously. And so, because this is an interstate river, it's a federal river, so any project to develop anything on this river had to be approved by the federal government, which means it had to go through Congress, which gave all of the representatives of those other 7 states the opportunity to block any proposal for river development in any other state or for any other state's benefit. So it became very clear after that first proposal for a dam and an all-American canal that something had to change about the way water was developed in the Colorado River Basin, or nothing would ever be built. And if nothing was ever built, then the region would stagnate. Herbert Hoover is the one who negotiated the Colorado River Compact, which divided the river up between the upper basin states and the lower basin states. And that wasn't quite enough because the Colorado River Compact did not specify how water was going to be divided amongst the states in the upper basin and amongst the states in the lower basin. The upper basin's kind of politically out of the picture right now because the communities this is Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. Not very big, able to satisfy their needs with groundwater or smaller tributary streams to the Colorado River. So they don't need any water right away. But California does. And Los Angeles is big enough to be an attractive market for the electricity to be generated at the dam, and to need the water that was kind of made available by the dam. And Arizona and Nevada are the other 2 states in the lower basin. And Arizona is looking at California and going, we're going to lose. And so they did everything that they possibly could to halt the development of the of Hoover Dam because it was such a threat to their future water rights. And this held things up for a very, very long time. There are really good pictures on the Hoover Dam construction that are available. I don't remember where I got this one, but from the National Archives. So there's Los Angeles by 1924, the Chamber of Commerce was reporting that there was so little electricity available from local sources they could not, that new industrial plants were refusing to move in. So they were approaching an energy crisis. That was the source of their original concern, was energy rather than water, but they also were concerned that the water from the Owens Valley was not going to be enough to support the kind of growth that they were expecting and wanted to see. So they pushed very hard for this. But, and Arizona, keep looking at you, Arizona was dragging its heels and convincing other states, Utah and Nevada, to join in with objecting to the Hoover Dam project. The other people who got into the act were the electricity utilities, PG&E, and particularly Southern California Edison. Southern California Edison had actually surveyed the river with the Bureau of Reclamation 2 times, in 1902 and 1920 something or other, 1924 I think it was. I don't know why the Bureau of Reclamation went down the river looking for potential dam sites with representatives of Southern California Edison. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. Because what Southern California Edison did, predictably, immediately, upon returning from those surveys, is file water rights permits to generate all of the potential hydroelectric power on the Colorado River. They filed for 5 or 6 major dam sites. And by getting in their permit application first, they essentially had the right of first refusal to the water development along the Colorado River. So it's yet again a repetition of that water resources monopoly that was affecting the communities when they were just trying to build something big enough for their own, you know, for the city of Oakland. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll go back to that one. Okay. The way that the hydroelectric utilities voiced their opposition to this dam was by arguing that public ownership, public enterprises were inherently corrupt, that they led to bad government. A lot of the same kind of rhetoric that you hear in government critics, amongst government critics now. We don't have a very large political vocabulary in the United States. We just keep saying the same things over and over and over again. This from the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, Ohio, notice, because it's a national debate. They declared, as many business groups did, that Hoover Dam was a bad idea because it would open a wide crack in the door for the entry of state socialism. They said that this is again a quote, "This is a far cry from the ideas of the founders of this government. If the present tendency to center power and administration in Washington for all sorts of purposes not checked, the states of the Union will be reduced to the position of mere counties within the next 2 or 3 generations." It's the same argument that okay. When the dam was finally approved, it was only approved because Arizona was granted a little bit of extra water, and because a compromise was brokered with the private power utilities, so that half of the water from Hoover Dam is used to pump water into, half of the power from Hoover Dam is used to pump water into Southern California. Water is heavy, takes lots of energy. Then 30%, another 30% of the electricity generated at Hoover Dam is actually used in Los Angeles, or in the Los Angeles metropolitan region. Half of that is generated by Southern California Edison. Okay, so federal tax dollars built the dam, built the power plant. Southern California Edison did have to pay for their own turbines, but they then get the benefit of this federally constructed project essentially for free. Yeah?
Do they pay for the replacement turbines? Because there's been new turbines installed there. So there's
I assume that Southern California Edison pays for its own turbines, but they didn't have to pay for the dam. And it's very weird. I got started on this project because I went on the hard hat tour where you go down into the bowels of the dam, and there are all these folks running around in Southern California Edison uniforms. I'm like, this is a federal dam. What is the story with this? And this is the story. The thing that I think is significant about this is that that compromise, where a chunk of the power that was available for use by consumers was generated and sold by a private for-profit corporation, was not portrayed by backers of the dam as, you know, this is something we had to do to get this thing through, and it's really ultimately more important that the dam get built. It was portrayed as a real triumph of public-private cooperation. And because so much of my work is looking at what happened to the Progressive Era and New Deal ideas about government in the 20th century, this is part of it, is looking at these, portraying these compromises as really great things, rather than compromises that you need to make because you've got other priorities. Okay, so the second, now we'll go on to this slide here. This is, the map is too far away from you, but so this is a map showing both the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. And I think the kind of punchline here is we've got some water being diverted from Northern California into Central California, and then a lot of water coming from Central California down to Kern County. The blue, this is the Central Valley Project, and this is the State Water Plan. San Diego gets some of its water from the State Water Plan. Most of the water in the State Water Plan goes to one irrigation district called Westlands, which is the irrigation district that environmentalists love to hate. So, so the Central Valley Project was first proposed in 1919 in response to those conflicts between cities that needed drinking water and water for industry and irrigation districts that needed water for irrigation. And the folks who were looking at water management and water conflicts at that time looked around and said, we're going to be in trouble if we keep letting cities, we're never going to get anywhere if every single time a city needs to expand its water system, they end up in serious conflict with these irrigation districts. We need both cities and industry and agriculture, and the solution to this is to build our way out of the conflicts. If we build enough dams, if we build enough canals, if we move water from the places way up north where there's the most of it down into San Joaquin Valley, we can have both, and everybody will be happy, which has worked for a very, very long time, and it's not going to work anymore. Yeah. So, this was, the Central Valley Project was the first of these big projects. It was proposed in 1919 as a state project. The state could never get enough money together to build it. It was built under the auspices of the New Deal in the 1930s, and it's big. It includes now 20 dams, 500 miles of canals, moves 9 million acre-feet of water, and serves 2.5 million urban residents and 3 million acres of farmland. That's as of about 20 years ago, so probably now more. Funding is for the dam and construction. It's partly federal reclamation money that came in, just general taxpayer funds. Insofar as some of these dams also prevent floods, there's some flood control money that went into building the system. But most of the system is paid for by revenue from hydroelectric power generation at the dams. So there we've got that water and power connection once again. This again, very, very hard to get passed. It was difficult to get passed initially as a state project because it was going to be expensive. And then once the Depression began and the New Deal began, it was like, oh great, we can have the federal government pay for this once again. But the federal government came with some pretty serious strings attached, because the Reclamation Act, which was paying for this project, was designed to provide water to people on family farms, 160 acres or smaller farms. And most of the land in the Central Valley that was eligible for irrigation was already owned by much larger farms than that. Corporate Standard Oil owned and operated a bunch of farms, still does in Kern County. 66% of the land that was eligible for irrigation, that was appropriate for irrigation for the Central Valley Project, was held in holdings that were much larger than that 120 acres. The largest in Kern County was over 200,000 acres. Pretty big. Agribusiness by any other. That's Miller and Lux. The Kern County, I can't remember what their name is, but yeah. Kern County Land Company or something like that. But the second problem, and the people who own those really big spreads didn't want to break them up, and they didn't want to have to abide by rules from the Bureau of Reclamation that said if you take our water, you have to sell off your excess property. So that became a big conflict for a long time. But the other major conflict with getting this passed was, again, the utilities. So PG&E led the opposition when this was a state proposal, and when it was approved for New Deal construction, PG&E actually sponsored a referendum, a public referendum, to block it. At that point, big agriculture joined the opposition because they didn't want the acreage limitations to go into effect. The thing did get built, and it got built again because of a compromise on the electricity and a compromise on the acreage limitations, where by the 1940s, after there was one brief big push to enforce the acreage limitations, and then the federal government basically gave up. And as for the hydroelectric power, what they said to PG&E is, yeah, we'll generate the power and we'll sell it to you at wholesale rates, and then you can sell it to customers and distribute it at retail rates. So very like what happened at Hoover Dam. So here are some pretty pictures of parts of the CVP. Okay. So Central Valley Project was put into place. Okay, so some of these are just random photographs that I think are cool. There is an amazing online archive. It's called the Online Archive of California, and it's got images from libraries and archives all over the state, and you can waste an enormous amount of time looking at pretty pictures from archives all over the state. So this is the scale of private irrigation in Kern County before, well before federal and state investment. And this is the scale of irrigation under that's the Free Kern Canal from the CVP, the Central Valley Project. So despite the compromises that brought about the Central Valley Project, there were still water needs that were being unmet, and there were also still people in California who were really worried about those acreage limitations and really frustrated by them and worried that the Bureau of Reclamation would start to implement them at some future date and break up these really large agribusiness holdings. And so in 1959, Governor Pat Brown sponsored the State Water Project, which moves a whole lot more. I don't have the statistics on how big it is, but it's also big. And the idea here was to supplement the Central Valley Project to make more water available for irrigated agriculture. And to do so through a system that was not subject to those acreage limitations. Oh, I forgot a quote. I've got to go back and give you a quote about the Central Valley Project. Here again, same language as before. This is a Tulare County grower who accused the Bureau of Reclamation of, quote, trying to socialize agriculture and force communism upon the people of the San Joaquin Valley by enforcing the acreage limitations.
I was thinking that the River project was for San Francisco.
I'll go put that up.
The Tehachapi?
Instead of, that's why I thought about it. That was
Hetchy.
Hetchy.
They sound similar.
Oh, that's in Yosemite.
Hetchy, yeah, that's in San Francisco.
This is the one from.
Yeah, Tehachapi is, yeah. He's restarting my pictures because I went too fast, I got too excited. I couldn't remember how many I'd gotten. Okay. So Central Valley Project, that's good. Central Valley Project was to provide more water without the acreage limitations. The main advocates were San Joaquin landowners on the southwestern and southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. And let me go back to our map here. So the folks along here who weren't getting water from the CVP, which went down the eastern side. This area contains some of the largest corporate land holdings in the United States. Support was highest among folks who had been using groundwater to irrigate because purchasing fuel to run a diesel pump to pump water out of the ground was really expensive. And they were starting to see some really worrisome side effects from groundwater pumping. There was as much as 30 feet of subsidence in some areas in the western San Joaquin. Water tables fell from about 55 feet below the surface in the 1930s to 200 feet in the 1940s and 50s. And we're going to see this again this year. You were just talking about your son, the almond grower, who's
Right.
In a world of hurt.
Yeah.
The water project was a real top priority for the Brown administration because he believed that water development was crucial to the future of the state. And support grew when the U.S. Supreme Court failed to give an outright exemption to the Central Valley Project for acreage limitations. There was a lot of opposition from Northern Californians who didn't like this map. They didn't want their water being sent from the Delta down to the south, so there's a lot of that regional political conflict over again. And there is the legacy of Hoover Dam and the legacy of the Central Valley Project also showed up, not this time in kind of anti-communist rhetoric, which is maybe a little surprising given that it was 1959, but rather in the fact that Brown refused to write into the state water plan any preference for public utility distribution of hydroelectric power. It's like, private utilities, we don't care, but we're not going to demand, we're not going to put that piece back into the puzzle. And he refused demands to put any limitations on the size of the farms that could get the subsidized water. And what he said was that although he agreed in principle with the idea of public ownership of water, and with keeping farms small, he said he was, quote, never convinced the small farmer could succeed or would be good for the economy of the state. So he basically acknowledged that California agriculture was corporate agriculture, it was large-scale agriculture.
What year was that?
1959.
The first government.
That's the first government.
Yeah.
That's the Brown that brought me my job indirectly by creating this state university system. So one of the reasons I think that there's no anti-communist rhetoric in the state water plan debates is that the big growers wanted the project. Okay, and so I see a lot of this water development, I see a lot of that rhetoric as political strategy that people use to throw whatever they can at whatever they don't like. And use the hot button language of the time. I also see it as very much indicative of the way people envision the role of government in doing things like developing utilities and developing services in the US, which is, it's necessary and good if it's for me, and it's big government and dangerous and too much spending and wasteful, all of those things, if it's for the benefit of somebody else. But to get back to where we started with San Diego's particular water woes, San Diego is dependent on these water systems. They're dependent on these water systems because they're available, because this is where the water is. And one of the great advantages that California cities have and Western cities have over places like Atlanta is that we have these giant irrigation networks to go buy water from when we outgrow our local water supplies. And so we have that kind of going for us in one way or another. But we don't have very robust water rights. Water rights in California, as you guys probably all know, are allocated in the order in which people start using the water, which means that if you are Imperial Valley and you started using water from the Colorado River first, when that water becomes scarce, you still get all of your water, and the people who came along after you don't. And what San Diego has done to try and deal with that is try to develop independent sources of supply where they control the rights. We did that with by buying very expensive water from water rights holders in the Imperial Valley. Very expensive, looks a little more sensible this year than it might have in previous years. And we're doing that with desal, with the Poseidon thing, yeah.
What about Diamond Lake? What about Diamond Lake? The newest reservoir in Southern California, right where it's California?
I haven't been following it. Who's that owned by, do you
I don't
know?
know, that's what I'm asking.
Well, they just built it as an area to store water, more water
Yeah,
for the southern area.
for the southern area.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can expand those local storage sites if we can get the ground for them. So I guess we're doing a little bit more building. But the big efforts that have been prominent around here have been the desalinization plant and the purchase of the water from the Imperial Valley farmers. And I see really serious problems with both of those. One is that if cities keep buying water from agriculture, eventually there's only so much water, and we need food too, and we need to grow stuff too. And it's not a sort of endless deep pit. There are efficiencies that agriculture can put into place to reduce the amount of water per pound of food grown, but they only go so far. And the other is things like desalinization require an enormous amount of energy. And an enormous percentage of the energy used in California is hydroelectric power, which means it too is dependent on rainfall. Yeah. And solar power, but the big contributors are still hydro. There's still lots of hydro, and nobody is talking about that this year. Nobody's talking about the impact that the drought is going to have on electric power supplies. And I guess my sort of death knell warning here is, our snowpack. You can see citations in the news media. Some people say 30%, some people say 17%. Depends on the region. It's 17% up in Northern California, 30% in the Central Sierra, 23% in the Southern Sierra. And with global warming, that's only going to get worse. All of the projections suggest that we're not going to be able to rely on our snowpack as our sort of secondary reservoirs. So I'm ending on a kind of eek. But it's eek. So I think that water recycling would have been a lot better as a strategy. I know why it was defeated. It was defeated in San Diego because it got called toilet to tap. I would point out that we're getting water from the bottom of the Colorado River. You're with
something on the radio that said what we're drinking is the beer that was drunk in Las Vegas about 2 months ago.
Exactly.
That's great.
It's like, that whenever people, toilet to tap, scary toilet to tap, it's like,
So I'm sorry, I wasn't in San Diego when that happened, so how long ago was that?
Kind of ongoing.
4 or 5 years maybe?
4 or 5
I
years
think it was
ago?
further. I think it was longer ago than that. The water recycling debate.
Okay.
What do you?
Well, there was an in-depth report at PBS just 2 days ago about the new pure water system that
Yeah,
they
that's what it's
proposed,
being
which
called.
is what they relabeled the
Toilet to tap.
I mean, duh.
I think all you need to do is talk about the fact that we're always getting our water from the bottom of the watershed, and then it makes it sound a lot less disgusting. Just be grateful. Just be grateful you don't live in New Orleans. A much larger water system with a lot more people in it. Yeah.
Getting back to the dams, is there any life expectancy for those things? I mean, are they going to hold up forever, or?
They will not hold up forever. Hoover Dam, I'm not worried about. It's way over-engineered. It is built as an arch dam, and the mechanics of an arch dam are such that the water pushes at the keystone of the arch, and that sort of holds it up and pushes it into the rock. But there's enough concrete in that dam, you could have built that thing straight across and it would be fine. So that one's way over-engineered. But dams do fail and reservoirs do silt up, and there is a limited lifespan of dams. But that's, honestly, to me, seems like a less serious problem than total water supply. Because if your dam is nearing its end, end of its useful life, you just build another one in front of it and then knock it down. I mean, it's not that, you can plan for that. You can't plan for catastrophic failure, which does occur, but you can, yeah.
Well, that's my next point. Has there been any kind of record of earthquake damage for any of the dams? We've had a number of earthquakes here, and I just wonder about that.
Yeah, it seems to be okay. Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam both drip, because water will find its way through, kind of constant dripping. But I don't know of any damage there. The biggest catastrophic failure of a dam in California was 1928 when the St. Francis Dam came down, because it was put up on an unstable footing.
That was one in Los Angeles?
Yeah, that was in Los Angeles and Santa.
So are we going into the question and answer period?
Yeah.
Or- Okay.
No, I'm fine, whatever.
Hey, I have a question. I didn't really understand the hydroelectric power that we depended so much on that for our power, the water for our power. And the connection between water and power, electric power, is one that I don't think many people make. I don't know, but,
What's the difference? That 80% of the energy
right,
is used to pump the water?
to pump the water, but
Yeah.
then a
So
lot
if you
of
have
our...
less water to pump, then you're going to use less electricity.
Right.
No, and it's actually very efficient, which is why so many dams that are built for flood control or irrigation or water supply also have hydroelectric
Sure.
power. Because all you do to generate that power is you've got to dump the water out of the reservoir into a pipe anyway, and you stick a turbine in the middle of it.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that you may be right, is people aren't making that connection. And I don't know how much of our power in San Diego is hydro, but PG&E and Southern California Edison and the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, all of them are enormously dependent on hydroelectric power. Yeah.
So in our conversations a couple of weeks ago, you pointed out that one of the major sources of recycling, or the possibilities for recycling, is to have people reduce the landscape watering, which is the biggest chunk of watering.
By a lot.
And I had a question about that. I mean, lots of people in Kensington are now xeriscaping their yards, and an interesting trend architecturally is you're seeing in some places in Kensington, people are rethinking how to use their front yards rather than just saying, I'll put in xeriscaping. They're putting in patios, front yard patios, sort of using it as an opportunity. And I get that, and I think that's great. The thing that I'm asking is in Northern California, transplant in Northern California, is what's up with the trees? None of these trees, with the exception of the Torrey pines and the trees in the mountains, are native here. And so my question is, do you have, figures on the relative water use of trees versus, and what are we going to do about, basically in the long run, cutting back on the trees? And I just illustrated this with one point, which is a number of years ago when I called the city about whether or not they would plant trees, because they had a program where we'll plant the trees and take care of them. They didn't want to hear anything about palm trees. They hated palm trees. They wanted shady trees because they thought it was going to result in cooling of the urban landscape. But shady trees are the ones that use the water.
Palm trees are caves.
Is that true?
Yes, palm trees are incredibly thirsty.
That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, no, and Los Angeles about 3 or 4 years ago announced that they were cutting down most of the street palm trees and replacing them with drought-tolerant trees. Not drought-tolerant native trees, unfortunately, but drought-tolerant trees, because most real trees are better wildlife habitat, and there are lots of kinds of trees that use a lot less water than a palm tree does. But
Could you name a few?
there's a bunch of South African, the peppermint tree, which is mostly ukes, some of which you don't want overhanging your house, because particularly at the top of the slopes, because your house will burn down eventually. But there's a bunch of South African trees that are fairly low water use. If you want that information, more reliable than me would be there's a water conservation, a couple of water conservation gardens.
Okay, I guess I was interested in the concept, so I got
Yeah, but the concept. But so what about the trees? So the problem is, if you step back and look at the complexity of the urban landscape, is our native flora is chaparral, is coastal sage scrub. Not pretty, not shady. Although lemonade berry is delightful. But and if you were to replant all of our yards with coastal sage scrub, you would have good local wildlife habitat potentially, and you'd reduce our residential water use by 3/4, by 75%, because that's where most of our water goes. And the urban temperatures would probably go up significantly. And you'd recreate the urban heat island, because you'd have no shade. And it would be, and you'd have fire danger. Well, but no more fire danger than we have anyway with all the stuff that's growing. But you would use more electricity to cool the houses with air conditioning, because there's no shade. So it's a balance. And so, when in the 76, 77 drought, when we were up in the Bay Area on mandatory water rationing, we let everything die in the yard except the trees, and we kept the trees alive with the bathwater. But my solution to this would be, because we can't develop double pipes, we can't put in a second set of pipes, do local gray water recycling to keep trees and fruit trees and other things alive, because you generate enough water in the house to probably keep those shade trees going, particularly if you choose them wisely.
Yeah. Sarah, real quick, Sarah, before you answer that, probably it's 8, so probably just 1 or 2 questions.
Okay, whatever, I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, we are already using recycled water, the purple pipes on Highland Valley,
Okay.
near Ramona, Swift Highway Parkway, and they have these purple pipes, and they said, don't drink this water. And so they've raised the San Vicente Dam, and I think they're going to revisit the recycled water, like pumping it into the San Vicente Reservoir, and that will take out more impurities and things. So I think they're going to definitely revisit this recycled water. Maybe they're kind of bringing it in under the radar. But in the former golf course out where we live, they purchased water from the sewage treatment package that bring down to irrigate the golf course. And the golf courses save tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, and
So they're using recycled water.
yeah, we are. It's just not going back into the drinking water system. not yet, but it should. Yeah.
I seem to remember reading something about San Marcos or someplace that had just opened a desalinization plant, this
Oceanside.
Oceanside.
Mhm.
How is that working out?
It'll work fine as long as we have the electricity to run it.
How many people is it supposed to serve?
That I don't know. It's pretty big. It's got a pretty substantial capacity.
Is that Poseidon?
That's Poseidon. But you know, Poseidon was planned at a time when we thought that the San Onofre nuclear power plant was going to keep working.
Oh, yeah, that's what I had,
And are they using solar power?
I don't know. I don't know what they're using for power, but if you remember, you know, 10 years ago when we had a power shortage, and that power supply problem has not been solved. And for San Diego, it's worse because we don't have San Onofre anymore. I never thought I would regret the passing of the nuclear power plant.
But the wave power, there's a way of capturing
Yeah,
power
there's some.
from the waves as well, but there are some environmental issues with that.
Mhm.
The battle rages here in San Diego between the Metropolitan and LA,
Uh-huh.
and it's the authority of San Diego.
Yeah,
And
and
so the LA controls our water.
well, and that's why San Diego invested in buying water from the Imperial Valley, and that's part of the reason that Poseidon got approved. And I guess it's not Oceanside, it's Carlsbad, isn't it? Carlsbad, yeah.
And was that deal with Imperial Valley farmers, was that negotiated farm by farm, or was it an Imperial County?
I think it was an irrigation
County
district.
deal?
I think it was with the irrigation district, because it's the irrigation district that holds the water rights.
We're gonna, I think, yeah, we want to honor the, you know, the hour and 15 minutes. Is that for Sarah? As someone who's only been in Southern California for a year and a half, I learned so much, but we're just brought back so many wonderful.
Turn off the water when you brush your teeth.
Okay, I learned a phrase not too long ago, a Navy shower.
Navy shower.
I'd never heard of a Navy shower
I don't think we're quite
before.
a Navy shower
Okay.
yet, but we will be this summer, but don't run the water when you brush your teeth.
Okay.
Or when you do the dishes.
Right. But we've learned so much about water, and we've also learned from our friend Dr. Chris Larson that water is very, it's adhesive. If you put other things with water, you can make a lot of great things. So as a way to say thank you to you, we got you something, some fermented water here. And there's a card in there for you as well. So thank you so much.